Hello, and thank you very much for coming along this evening. This evening we're going to look at a very important global report that's come out this last week, a special report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You've been accustomed to my talking about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, over the years because they've been issuing the most significant scientific syntheses reports. These are reports that are syntheses of published scientific journal articles and books. They are synthesized by committees of scientists based out of Geneva, and then they publish synthesis volumes. Now, it's one of these special reports on the way to a synthesis volume that's just been issued this past week, and we want to look at it carefully because it's had an enormous impact on understanding our current circumstances and the fact that we're up against some real major problems. By we, I don't mean just we in the United States, we in the Northeast, we in Massachusetts. I mean we as a human community, because we're all based now on agriculture. And what this report dealt with was the climate impact of agriculture and the impact on agriculture of climate, the reciprocal link between one and the other, especially since agriculture has now become petro-dependent, that it's dependent on fossil fuels with tractors, fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, the whole match, whole shooting match of petrochemicals that is needed now to subsidize agriculture. A very dangerous situation to be in because your agriculture is supposed to be the one thing that captures solar energy, and what we're doing is expending fossilized solar energy, the rare amounts that we still have left of that, in order to produce current photosynthate, capture current sunlight in plants. That's a suicidal trajectory, but in addition, climate change is altering all the other parameters, particularly the rainfall patterns and the flooding patterns, as well as the drought. The water hasn't left the Earth system, it's rearranged itself because of the heating of the atmosphere. The atmosphere itself has been heating because the gases that are resulting from carbon fossil fuel emissions let light through, but they don't let heat out. And the heat's been building up at the surface, causing a churning effect in the global hydrosphere. That is, the hydrological cycle has been sped up and involves more and more large quantities of water, either taken out of areas that are drought prone or poured into areas that receive ample rainfall in the past and are now becoming quite flooded. Well, agriculture has been arranged in reference to those over the last 5,000 years, and we're in deep trouble now because those regions are changing very rapidly and very unpredictably, with dire impacts on U.S. agriculture, but also on global agriculture. So, in effect, we've all become migrants on a burning planet. There's no place to hide and no other place to go. We're in trouble here because what we're doing to save ourselves is actually accelerating our collapse. This last year, and in fact the last couple of years, we've seen some troubling events like temperatures spiking in southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, France, and the like. And in fact, leading to wildfires in many areas, very much like the California wildfires that we're seeing here in the United States. Other changes seem to include ocean currents and the ocean-atmosphere-land interactions. Oceans contain all of this heat, which normally goes up in the Gulf Stream between Ireland and Iceland, and then sinks and comes back down, as the blue arrows show. But because of all the meltwater from Greenland, there's been a surface presence of low temperature water that's blocked the northern movement of that Gulf Stream. The result is that the air that moves over it is moving further south. The hot air is not going up over the warm Gulf Stream into northern Europe, but it's being blown into, in effect, Portugal, Spain, France, and southern Europe. That's changing, it appears, not yet definitive, but it appears that it's changing the thermohaline circulation system, the THC system in the North Atlantic. The meltwater from Greenland's glaciers might be disrupting the THC, causing drought in the Mediterranean areas and wetter, colder weather further north. The real problem with changing the THC system, thermohaline circulation system, thermal for heat, haline for salt, means that areas in this whole region that get their wind patterns from the west are going to change rather abruptly, as they have in the past. There's been a dramatic case of this happening in the past, right around the entire globe. We're now seeing dramatic floodings occurring in places as far as China, as well as drought and wildfires in California. We're seeing global patterns change. And at the same time, emissions are continuing to increase. In fact, from China, the report is that they're increasing faster than elsewhere in the world and have reached totals that are very worrisome indeed. Now, this is the most important background to the climate report that was issued by the UN and the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this last week, just this past week, called Climate Change and Land. Because our relationship as a human species to the land is changing radically as the hydrological cycle changes and droughts and floods change. Take a look. The impact's not pretty. It's going to be rather dramatic.
The United Nations top panel of climate scientists is warning humans are consuming land and water resources at an unprecedented rate, with the climate crisis and biodiversity loss already threatening the food supply of hundreds of millions of people. In a report out today, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns without dramatic action, extreme weather and rising temperatures will turn even more fertile land into desert, shrinking the global food supply even as the world's population rises to more than 7.5 billion people. This is climate scientist, IPCC co-chair Valérie Masson-Damat.
We humans affect more than 70% of ice-free land. A quarter of this land is degraded. The way we produce food and what we eat contributes to the loss of natural ecosystems and declining biodiversity. When land is degraded, it reduces the soil's ability to take up carbon, and this exacerbates climate change. In turn, climate change exacerbates land degradation in many different ways. Today, 500 million people live in areas that experience desertification.
The IPCC recommends dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, along with more efficient farming methods and a shift in diets away from dairy and meat, which produce vast amounts of methane and carbon dioxide while using large amounts of land. As President Trump visited victims of mass shootings in Dayton, Ohio and El Paso, Texas Wednesday, federal agents swept through 7 poultry processing plants in Mississippi, arresting 680 people in one of the largest immigration raids in U.S. history.
Okay, well, it may seem that those immigration raids are unrelated to climate change, but in fact they're closely related. And we'll see, in fact, those immigration laws that are being sort of enforced at this point, and raids that are somewhat illegally being enforced at this point, are directly related to the fact that there's a surge of population trying to get into the United States. Well, in fact, the impact of agriculture, on agriculture, of a changing climate has been emphasized by scientists for more than 30 years. In fact, there was some prophetic and enduring testimony offered by Jim Hansen, the climatologist, back in June of 1988, 31 years ago. And 3 months later, in September 1988, there was testimony from Tim Weiskel at Harvard on the social impact of that. If you want to look at it, there have been books that have followed them up. The Senate held hearings in 1988, and they led eventually to the revelation of Jim Hansen, which he wrote up in a series of articles for 30 years, and then published recently a book called Storms of My Grandchildren. And at the time, the testimony of Tim Weiskel was put out in a book called Environmental Decline in Public Policy. Jim Hansen's book was Storms of My Grandchildren, but look at the subtitle, crucial, The Truth About the Coming Climate Catastrophe and Our Last Chance to Save Humanity. Well, this is based on his 1988 testimony and every piece of evidence he's marshaled ever since over the last 31 years of his career. As for the Environmental Decline in Public Policy book, you should see that his subtitle was on Pattern, Trend, and Prospect, and summarized what was happening in terms of two diagrams. We could either stabilize populations in face of a declining but stabilized carrying capacity and go infinitely into the future, or we would exceed that carrying capacity and collapse shortly thereafter. This was the statement made to the Senate in 1988. Well, as we've found since, and in fact learned before that, sustainability versus ecological overshoot and collapse has been the theme of human history since we have records. Since the earliest civilization, soil and civilization has been a very strong theme, and complex societies have collapsed in the past. The human impact on environments has been enormous over thousands of years, especially in hydraulic civilizations like Egypt. The collapse has been rather dramatic and is left in the archaeological record. If you ask now, for example, why ancient Egypt fell, the climatologists and paleoclimatologists and climate archaeologists are now finding evidence of abrupt change in ancient climate, leading to the simultaneous collapse of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and perhaps that shift in the North Atlantic thermohaline circulation system. Megadrought and collapse has been the theme, and one pursued by Harvey Weiss, an archaeologist at Yale, who has brought together a series of different contributions from scholars all over the world, looking from early agriculture to Angkor Wat and the collapse of the Angkor Wat civilization in Cambodia. The tragedy has been that we treat soil like dirt. Topsoil, climate change, and collapse of civilizations have been the drumbeat of human history. Topsoil is a very, very thin component of the Earth system. You can see it when the rock slide strips it away. Very, very thin. And yet we're overexploiting it and exposing it then to torrential rains and watching it disappear in various kinds of flood situations as erosion into the ocean. This was pointed out back in 2005. 14 years ago, the UN came up with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report and asked the question, is the Earth's future in danger? You can get access to these reports on the Transition Studies website and trace the history of statements by scientists about the proportions of foodstuffs to wildlife to human populations and how they've changed over time. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report pointed out 14 years ago that we were on an unsustainable trajectory. We can't continue infinitely to grow human populations and deprecate and destroy natural ecosystems and the food systems upon which we depend. No amount of genetic engineering will address the ethical problem of limit posed by real and very important recent studies. The UN in 2017, 2 years ago, put out a report, a dire report, they called it at the time, on rising hunger despite ample food supplies. The distribution issue, in other words, is even more crucial as a cause of immediate hunger than the production issue. But the production trajectories are not good in the Anthropocene. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences carried an article making it very clear that Earth could enter an unstable period of change and then flip into a hothouse climate state, making current agriculture impossible. Runaway climate change could trigger this hothouse Earth with 200-foot sea level rises that scientists warned about, and the incumbent collapse of agriculture. That's what the burden of this report of the 8th of August, last week, last Thursday, this came out. Read it. You've got access to it through Transition Studies, and it's absolutely sobering. Take a look.
It is a dire warning. The latest science paints a picture of a future in the grips of extreme weather. William Brangham reports on how much impact climate change and the way we use our land will have on the very basics of life.
If we don't quickly change the way we grow our food and manage the land on Earth, we will not be able to avoid the worst damages from climate change. That grim assessment comes from a new report issued today in Geneva by the United Nations Interpanel on Climate Change. Over 100 experts from 53 nations contributed to the report. The report details a global feedback loop where our land management makes climate change worse, and then climate change impacts the land even more. Right now, how we grow food, chop down forests, and drain wetlands contributes about 23% of human greenhouse gas emissions. For example, the report notes that the soils essential for growing food are being lost 10 to 100 times faster than they're being replenished. As that soil degrades, crop yields will fall, and the soil itself loses its natural ability to absorb greenhouse gases, which then makes climate change worse and perpetuates the cycle. According to the report, about 500 million people live in areas that are turning quickly to desert. These millions of people are increasingly vulnerable to heat waves and floods and may soon find their homes unlivable. The report does offer some hope, pointing out how better land management could reverse some of these trends. It also suggests things like reducing food waste, because 1/3 of all food that's produced gets wasted, and shifting our diet away from meat, which requires far more energy to produce than a plant-based diet. For more on what this report says and how we ought to respond, I'm joined by Janet Ranganathan. She's the Vice President for Science and Research at the World Resources Institute. Welcome to the NewsHour. This report seems to lay out the essential paradox of modern life, which is the way we have grown food and managed the lands all over the planet have built this incredible society that we live in, but now we realize that those exact methods imperil that society, right? Isn't that what this is saying?
Yes.
Yes, it's saying that very clearly. And it's saying, in fact, that we can't continue to do this. We're killing ourselves by the way we're feeding ourselves and managing the land to feed ourselves. The reason is we've become petro-dependent in that agriculture and produce more greenhouse gases, destroying the capacity of the earth to absorb the CO2 that we produce in industry, in automobiles, and everywhere else. So it's a staggering report, and in fact it leads people with an understanding of these feedback loops to look nostalgically at the years when we estimated that we had 12 years to save the planet. Some of them are saying, no, you've got 18 months. That's it. Climate change, 12 years to save the planet, make that 18 months. Extraordinary change in a very short period of time. Why? This land is the only land there is. We're not going anywhere else that has arable land. We're on the only livable spaceship in the known universe, and we're losing the one thing, topsoil, which makes it possible for us to grow plants that increase the food supply. This is why the migrant issue is very relevant. Bill McKibben decided, in effect, to demonstrate, and in fact got arrested, protesting immigration policy. He wrote an article, a little letter to the New Yorker, indicating why I decided to get arrested. Recent reporting has made it clear that drought and heat have made it hard to grow food in the highlands of Honduras and Guatemala, starting many farmers on the journey that eventually takes them to the U.S. border, he said. As this week's report from the IPCC makes clear, there will be infinitely more of them as the century grinds hotly on. The UN estimates that we can expect somewhere between 200 million and 1 billion climate refugees on the move around the world. Between 200 million and 1 billion climate refugees around the world. This is staggering, and it makes us understand the immigration issue in a very different light. People are being driven off their land, not by landlords or by financial debt so much, but by the incapacity of the land to produce food any longer. Why? Well, because the climate has changed to such an extent. And those that are the biggest victims are those that have contributed the least to the carbon emissions in the atmosphere. It's staggering. As he put it, we can't be like them, those of us who have options and resources and connections, but we can in some small way be with them. A staggering testimony, it seems to me, a very important one, of solidarity on the Earth's surface. We can't be like them, but we can be with them. Very powerful words from a leader of climate action on the issue of immigration. This is why we are all now migrants on a burning planet. There is no place to hide and no other place to go. Fossil fuel-driven climate change will limit global food production, increase mass migration, and threaten the survival of civilization. There's no question about that. But we're not taking it seriously enough, quickly enough. Our leaders, in fact, are dismissing the whole issue as if it weren't even existing, as if we can continue to pour the residue of coal into the global atmosphere infinitely in order to make more profit, that we can continue to use fossil fuel intensive agricultural techniques that degrade soil, erode soil, and ruin the capacity of agriculture to capture CO2 from the atmosphere. Absolute ignorance at a scale we can no longer afford. Political leadership around the world is figuring out how to try to go to other planets, but there is no other planet. We need desperately, in fact, to live on this one. A new kind of alliance is needed. It is emerging around the world to work together to devise a just and sustainable transition for the future.